Otwituaries. Tiny poetic elegies for the celebrated, the infamous and the obscure. Written and presented by Andy Jackson.
Welcome to the monthly Otwituaries podcast. I've been writing these short tweet-length poems called Otwituaries to celebrate the passing of celebrities both great and obscure since 2012. They try to capture something of that person in up to 280 characters. The only qualification is that the person has to be someone whose contribution to the world has had an influence on me, however minor. There are now over 800 of them. They aren't necessarily great poems, but they do come from the heart. The Otwituaries are published as a kind of instant response. They appear initially on X, what used to be called Twitter until last month, Facebook and Instagram, and then are gathered on the Otwituaries blog at otwituaries.blogspot.com. Please do follow them if you enjoy the ones you hear in this podcast. This is the podcast for the month of July 2023. This month we feature another typically mixed bag, a 60s singer and actor of some notoriety, the first £1 million footballer, a camp wrestling star from the halcyon days of TV wrestling, and an Irish singer of the 1980s and 90s who also courted her own particular notoriety. We begin with Jane Birkin, a singer and actor who rose to prominence in the 1960s, largely through her vocal performance on a record by a legendary French singer-songwriter and certified lecher Serge Gainsbourg called Je t'aime, moi non plus. You know the one, that one with heavy breathing which we are probably expected to interpret as people having sex. The song title translates as I love you, me neither, which would seem to imply that it was a fairly casual relationship. Well, it was the swinging 60s. The record was a fruity one-hit wonder in 1969. It rarely gets played on the radio, although I do remember a DJ on Manchester's Radio Piccadilly called Umberto playing it on The Breakfast Show when I must have been a young teenager. Once the record finished, he memorably said, "Mums and dads, if there are kids listening and wondering what that record was all about, tell them the singer was an asthmatic." It's tempting to see Jane Birkin as a peculiarity of the 1960s, but she had a significant career on screen and on record for several decades, particularly in France, where she was rightly revered. Bewitching, elfin and vulnerable, she occupies a place in cultural history that is unfortunately impossible to define without mentioning that record. Jane Birkin died July 16th, 2023. Life is a dream made of breath, an ecstatic song. Love is a fever with no cure except a little death. But we loved you. Me neither. I know not everyone likes football, and writing dozens of obituaries about deceased football stars of yesteryear would get very repetitive. But every so often I read of the death of a player whose place in history is defined by something different. Trevor Francis was a soft-spoken West Countryman who seemed an unlikely superstar. Undoubtedly gifted and great to watch, his career revolved around him being the first £1 million footballer in the UK. He was bought by Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest Club from Birmingham City in 1979 for a little over £1 million, the first seven-figure transfer fee in football. He quickly repaid that money with vital goals that led to Forest being kings of both English and European football at the end of the 1970s. That transfer was the start of a new era of football where money and inflated fees for players began to define the game. I used to read a comic called Tiger and Scorcher in my teens, and for one summer, Francis wrote a guest column about his experiences playing for Detroit Express in the USA. There were lots of little anecdotes about life in the USA with his wife Helen, and he came over to me as a decent, hard-working sportsman who couldn't quite believe his luck. After all, it wasn't his fault that somebody paid £1 million for his services. Football clubs regularly pay £1 million for a 15-year-old prospect these days, but it was an incredible amount back then. We thought the world had gone mad, and that there was no way a player could live up to that price tag. How little things have changed. Trevor Francis died July 24th, 2023. In a flash, he is where the ball is, almost disbelieving in himself as the goal sucks in man and ball and spits both out. The game goes from simple to complicated in a moment, and for a million reasons. Adrian Street. Now there's a name from the swirling mists of 1960s and 70s television. Son of a Welsh miner, he took up wrestling and appeared many times on ITV's World of Sport wrestling slot among such notable names as Mick McManus, Jackie Pallo, and my favourite, Les Kellett. He was always accompanied to the ring by his manager and eventually wife, Miss Linda. What made Street different was his appearance. Rather than the typical portly middle-aged wrestling hardman in fraying trunks, he took to the stage in lurex, feather boas and sequins, a burly blonde grappler with the campest persona in the business. He was known by many nicknames: the sadist in sequins, the exotic one. He recorded a camp and suggestive, out-of-tune torch song, Sweet Transvestite with a Broken Nose, as Exotic Adrian Street and the Pile Drivers. Worth seeking out on YouTube, but do ensure that you have St. John's Ambulance standing by. Street was what was known as a heel, the bad guy in the wrestling world. Low blows, gouges and sly kicks in the unmentionables when the referee's back was turned. He wasn't the best wrestler, or even the best known wrestler, but he was probably the best dressed. Whatever you think about the camp comedy of the professional wrestling scene back in the 70s, he was wrestling's first rock and roll star. In the words of another of his terrible songs, violence is golden. Adrian Street died July 24th, 2023. Hail to the heel, sadist in sequins, the glamorous and the grotesque, the menace and the mince, kissing a foe's forehead, half man, half Nelson, your whole life a public warning. A nation in mourning. How often do we hear that? But in the case of the late Sinead O'Connor, it really did feel like no one had a bad word to say about her at the end. Strange for a singer who so enraged Frank Sinatra that he was moved to say of her, "This must be one stupid broad, I'd kick her ass if she were a guy." This is in response to her tearing up a picture of the Pope on US television in protest at years of child abuse in the Roman Catholic Church worldwide. Brave, I'm sure you'll agree. Sinead O'Connor was a distinctive and uncompromising voice both on record and on camera. The public will remember her for the tears on the stark video for Nothing Compares to You, the song Prince gave her. But at least I feel I was slightly earlier to the party this time. I didn't buy her first single, Troy, but I was blown away by the pop hooks and anti-racist sentiment of her 1987 breakthrough single, Mandinka. I also loved her 1990 song, The Emperor's New Clothes, in which she set out her manifesto. I will live by my own policies. I will sleep with a clear conscience. A mantra she stuck to all her life. My most compelling Sinead moment was at the movies, however. Jim Sheridan's powerful 1993 film about the miscarriage of justice surrounding the Guildford Four, In the Name of the Father. I remember sitting in the cinema, pinned to my seat by the closing song, You Made Me the Thief of Your Heart, a song that starts like a whisper and ends in an inferno. It is beyond amazing. Stop this podcast and go and listen to it now. Sinead O'Connor died July 26th, 2023. A song stands against violence, turns the unsayable into art. Sing it now. They cannot silence what was truth from the start, the tenderness and defiance that made you thief of my heart. Also in July, we lost the legend, the great American songbook, Tony Bennett, the British singer, Vince Hill, also sadly the respected journalist and newsreader, George Alagaya. Check out their Otwituaries at otwituaries.blogspot.com. You can follow the Otwituaries via my Facebook page, Instagram feed, and by using the hashtag Otwituary on X, unless it's reverted to being called Twitter by the time you hear this. I'll be back next month with more stories and more poems. Until then, mind how you go.
You've been listening to Otwituaries, a monthly selection of tiny poetic elegies for the celebrated, the infamous and the obscure. Written and presented by Andy Jackson. The music is by Mark Vivian.